It just has to do with your brightness perception, that at the same lux level at the eye, obviously if you have higher lux level, the space is going to appear brighter. But if you also have a cooler light source, because you're more sensitive to short wavelength when it comes to brightness perception, the space for the same photopic illuminance, the space is going to appear brighter if you have a cooler light source. So that's sort of an energy efficient trick, that if you want to minimize the sort of the amount of energy you're using in the space, you can change the color to make it a little bit cooler, the space will appear brighter. Of course, a lot of people sometimes don't like the cooler light sources because they may look aesthetically not pleasing. So you may not do that because of aesthetics as well. And we also always tend to control for glare. So we want to minimize glare. We want to minimize reflections and shadows that could make it difficult for us to see the task that we want to be able to see. Now, in terms of culture, experiences, and expectations, we all know, and I think that's not as critical, at least from my recollection from a long time ago when I was living in Brazil, is that typically windows are very common in spaces, and that's not very much true here in the United States. You have a lot of deep core buildings where you have a lot of spaces without windows, and we do know that people will prefer spaces with windows. So spaces with windows, and in particular spaces with views, are going to be seen as more valuable, and people will actually like that more. And there is a hypothesis that they call the biophilia hypothesis, that one of the reasons why we crave for having that view is because we like to be in contact with nature. So that's something that it's very much used here in the design in the United States. The other thing too is the color, okay? And what's interesting about colors, color can also send a message. And there's been a lot of research, and the reason why I'm talking specifically about the red colors, because we're doing a lot of work looking at the alerting effects of light, and we're seeing a very strong alerting effect of red color. And we're trying to understand the reasons why. And it's very interesting that the color red, it really sends a message to the body. It has sort of an implication that it's a danger, or something is dangerous, or something may be sort of, you might be in danger because of that red color. So for example, fire trucks are red. Anything warning is red. So it gives you that sort of bad connotation. And it's very interesting that that may cause a reaction in your body, a reaction that you are under threat. And then your flight and fight system would react and would maintain that alertness. So there has been some studies where if they looked at people wearing blue, gray, or red shirt, and those that were wearing red shirts were actually seen as being more aggressive. So red makes you appear angrier. The red color also makes you stronger. So when you do the grip, the force grip, you tend to have more strength when the grip handles are in red color. And there has been study looking at the fact that red makes you appear more attractive, and that's particularly true with women having red lipsticks or red outfits, because there is that idea that a person is more attractive when they're wearing red. So red does give you a message, or does give you a sort of something that your body will react to. And we are actually measuring physiological changes with the red color, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have the non-visual effects, and within the non-visuals, you're going to have the phase shifting, which is entraining your biological clock to the local time on Earth. Or you can have that direct acute effect, which is, I call it light as a cup of coffee. It really is something that will give you this strong alerting effect without necessarily affecting your biological clock. So just as a brief background, circadian rhythms are every rhythm in our body that repeats at approximately every 24 hours. Circa is about, D is a day, And as Mark mentioned, if people are in a dark cave, like those miners in Chile that were in a dark cave for many weeks, they're going to continue to have the biological clock functioning. The difference is that the clock will run with a period slightly longer than 24 hours. So over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, people are out of sync with their watch. And light or light-dark patterns are the major synchronizers of the circadian system to the local time on Earth. So we as humans need to be exposed to morning light every day. If we're not exposed to that morning light every day, we run the risk to be disrupted. Or if we're exposed to too much light in the middle of the night, such as what happens with shift workers, for example, we can suffer from what we call circadian disruption. And that cartoon here it's a cartoon of a shift worker that is always disrupted because they're always jet lagged. They're awake at the wrong times. They're getting light at the wrong times. They're trying to sleep at the wrong times. And that has a lot of physiological and behavioral negative consequences, from poor performance and poor sleep all the way to increased risk for diabetes, obesity, and cancer. Now, one of the very well-known circadian or diurnal rhythm is the sleep-wake cycle. We as diurnal species, we're supposed to be awake during the day and asleep at night. And the circadian, the sleep-wake cycle is influenced by 2 systems. One is what we call the circadian system, which is your biological clock telling you to stay awake during the day and to fall asleep at night. And we also have what we call the homeostatic system, which is a sleep pressure. When you first get up, you have very little sleep pressure. As time goes by, you increase that sleep pressure and you tend to feel sleepier. And that's one of the reasons why we all drink coffee, and there's nothing better than Brazilian coffee. And I hear that Colombian coffee is good, but I think Brazilian is better without any question. So the main question that we always had is, why do we sleep? We all need sleep. We are very vulnerable when we're sleeping. And why is it that every species on the planet need to have some time to sleep? And there has been some very recent research showing that one of the main reasons why we sleep is that sleep cleans up the debris in the brain that accumulates during our wakefulness. So as you are awake, you're accumulating that debris in the brain. When you fall asleep, your brain vessels open up. You have a fluid that comes through the brain, and it cleans up the brain, and it basically allows you to be ready to start another day. There's also been a lot of work showing that sleep promotes learning and consolidates memory. So a lot of times things that you learn during the day are going to be consolidated in your brain during your sleep at night. And if you skip that night of sleep, you don't have that consolidation of the memory. So those of us who spend all night awake studying for exam, we're probably going to do worse than those that study in the evening, have a good night's sleep, and wake up in the morning, because by sleeping, they are consolidating that memory. And as I mentioned, sleep has a lot of negative effects, from reduced performance and poor, or sleep deprivation has a lot of negative effects. And it's also, I mean, you can't dissociate sleep deprivation from circadian disruption, because if you have circadian disruption, you're going to be sleep deprived because you're not going to have that alignment between your circadian and your homeostatic system. And this circadian disruption / sleep deprivation is associated with a series of maladies. So just a summary of what we know from the science is that light does set the timing of our biological clock. So it promotes what we call entrainment, or synchronization between the biological clock and your watch or your external watch. For that, we do need morning light. And as Mark mentioned and showed with the circadian stimulus, we tend to have more sensitivity at the short wavelength or blue light. So blue light is more effective at promoting circadian entrainment. Now, light also has a direct acute effect on people. It's like a cup of coffee any time of day and night. If you're exposed to light, you're going to feel more alert. And what's very interesting about the acute alerting effect of light is that it does not have to be blue light. Red light does the same thing, and I'll show you in a minute at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to start with entrainment, and that is really following what Mark spoke about. The UL recommendation was really based on a lot of the work that we and others have done, but we have been in the field testing that impact of the CS, or the circadian stimulus, of 0.3 during the day and less than 0.1 in the evening. And we've shown positive impact on Alzheimer's disease patients, older adults with sleep early onset, so we delay their sleep so that they can go to bed a little bit later and wake up later. Adolescents that tend to go to bed late, we've been able to advance the timing of their sleep. Premature infants, it's been shown that premature infants that receive cycle light during hospitalization tend to have better entrainment when they go home. And cancer patients undergoing treatment. So we've been able to show that there's an improvement in cancer patients' outcomes when they receive a strong, robust light-dark pattern. So in terms of circadian stimulus, the components are various, and Mark touched on it, and I'll talk a little bit about how to implement and how to obtain more effectively that circadian stimulus at the eye that we're proposing. So the overall proposal is to have at least a CS of 0.3 or greater during the daytime hours, and a CS of less than 0.1 during the evening hours. So in terms of the correlated color temperature, that's one of the things that we are stressing a lot when it comes to designing lighting for the circadian system. You cannot use CCT as a metric. You really need to ask the manufacturer for the spectral power distribution. And if you look at these graphs that we're showing here, this graph here it's very clear that for example, for a CCT of 2700K, you can have wide variation in the amount of light at the eye that you need to achieve that CS of 0.3. So you can actually be very energy efficient if you pick the right SPD for the light source that you're specifying. So remember, play with the SPDs, ask the manufacturers to give you the options, because you can have a warm color environment and you can still have good circadian stimulus. It's just a matter of getting the right spectrum. In general, as Mark mentioned, lower light levels will achieve relatively low CS values unless they're compensating for a little bit of more power at the shorter wavelengths, but that difference is not extremely great. And as he answered one of the questions, you can maintain a single correlated color temperature, or SPD, throughout the day and achieve the changes in CS by simply changing the light levels. So a dimming system should be enough for you to achieve that CS of 0.3 during the day and less than 0.1 in the evening. And here's just an example of how important light levels are compared to spectrum. So if you have, for example, luminaires that have a 3000K or a 5000K light source, and you have 300 lux horizontal or 500 lux horizontal, which are what the IES recommendations are for office spaces. So if you go from 3000K to 5000K on a 300 lux horizontal, you go from no fixtures achieving that CS of 0.3 to 2 fixtures out of 12 achieving the CS of 0.3. Now, if you go on a 3000K, if you go instead from a 300 lux horizontal to a 500 lux horizontal, you go from 0 to 9 fixtures out of 12 that would achieve that CS of 0.3. So you gain a lot more by adding or increasing light levels than you do by changing spectrum. The other important and good trick is the intensity distribution. And Mark mentioned, you want to have light at the eye, so it's vertical. You also don't want to have very narrow beam. And one of the things from the work that we've been doing, and it's a tip for people, is you want to have a ratio between vertical and horizontal and vertical lights of at least 0.65. The higher that ratio, the better. But a ratio of 0.65 will give you good vertical illuminance for the amount of horizontal illuminance you put on the table or on the horizontal surface. So the other thing that is important, and that's that graph is a little bit complicated, but I'm just going to summarize it for you. So we looked at different types of fixtures: 2x2, 2x4, recessed downlights, direct pendant, indirect pendant, or direct indirect pendant. And then the circles are always 300 lux. I'm sorry, the circles are always 5,000 K. The triangles are always 3,000 K. The double circle is 500 lux, and the double triangles are 500 lux. So what you see here from the graphs is when you have 300 lux on the work plane, very few fixtures will be above that threshold of CS of 0.3. By the time you go to 500 lux, you actually have a lot of them complying or reaching that target CS of 0.3. In general, recessed downlights will give you less light at the eye, while direct and indirect pendants will give you more light at the eye. And that's because they have a bigger ratio between horizontal and vertical surfaces. If you add, though, a sort of a fixture under your computer screen or a desktop luminaire, you're able to reach that CS to a much higher for two reasons. It can be saturated blue, which is very strong stimulus, and it's closer to your eye, so it can deliver that CS very effectively. Now, Mark mentioned that, so I'm going to go really quickly because I know we're running out of time. So the circadian lighting design process, the first thing you do is you decide on your design objectives. Do I want to maintain entrainment, which is what the UL guide is telling you to do? Or do I want to just maintain alertness, or do I want to do both? Then you formulate your 3D module with any of the lighting calculation software. So AGI 32 or Dialux, any of the software that you're used to working. Now, the key difference is instead of putting horizontal points, you're also going to put vertical points. So points where you think people are going to be looking at in the space based on the layout of the space. Then you calculate, you get the IS files from the manufacturers, and then the first thing you do is you meet your visibility requirements. You have to do that because that's following the IS guides. Then you calculate, by meeting those visibility requirements, you're going to calculate how much that would give you in terms of vertical illuminance. Now, sometimes you know where people are going to be looking at and you know the layout. Sometimes you don't. If you don't know the layout, you just have to do a grid and look at a whole grid. Okay? So what you do with those vertical illuminances that you calculate in your design, you then get the spectral power distribution of the light source, and you use the CS calculator, which is available online, and there's the link to it, and it's free. And you can then calculate how much of that light you need to achieve that CS of 0.3. Sometimes on your first design, you're not going to get there, so you have to go back, redo your design so that you increase or decrease the light levels for you to be able to achieve that CS of 0.3. Now, quickly, we do have the alerting effects of light, and that's really to promote acute alertness, and that can be done at any time of day or night. It's unlike the entrainment, which morning is best. For alertness is any time of day and night. What's most interesting about alertness is that these are studies that we have done here at the lab where we were measuring EEG, which is brain activities, and this is alpha power. So an increase in alpha power equals sleepier or more, you're more fatigued or more sleepy. And what we see is that there is a significant decrease in the alpha power with both blue and red lights. So you don't need to use blue only. You can use red. Now, why would you do that? The advantage of using red, especially at nighttime, is that red light will not suppress melatonin compared to blue that will. And the suppression of melatonin during the nighttime has been linked to a series of maladies, including increased risk for breast cancer. So for shift workers, red light at night may be a better solution than blue light. We also saw that alerting effect of the red and the blue during the daytime hours, during the post-lunch dip. So again, it doesn't matter what time of day and night, you are seeing that impact of light on that acute direct effect. So some of the tips here for designing lighting for circadian entrainment and alertness is think about layers of light. You know, I'm saying out loud here, forget about just thinking about ceiling lights. Think outside the ceiling. Think about luminaires and fixtures that are going to be in your field of view, close to you, and that it can change colors, because that will help you achieve what you need to achieve in a more energy effective way. So here are examples of things that we have been working here at the LRC, developing these lights to be able to deliver the light without necessarily changing how your ceiling lights are being designed. So in the application, I'm going to quickly show, and this hopefully you'll be able to go to our website and see this new pattern book that we, or pattern website that we have published this past year. It's really trying to design for different spaces so that you can start coming up with ideas and knowing what to ask for. So here is the link to it, and again, it's freely available. And right now we have senior care in offices, and we're getting ready with the healthcare and the schools. So if you go to the senior care, you can choose the room, assisted living with a kitchen, or a nursing home with a single room or common areas. And then if you go to each of them, you will have a design, and then you would have what you would do during the day. So in this case, it's a tunable system that changes the spectrum. Like Mark said, it doesn't have to be tunable. We just pick that. There are examples there that it's a single CCT without changing the spectrum. And you know what kind of light level that you need to achieve the CS at different times of day. Again, those are calculations with a specific SPD. If you change the SPD, you're going to change these calculations. So this is just changing from, you know, morning to evening and to night. Here's another example for offices. One solution to increase is to add cove lighting with a saturated blue, and that can actually change at night to saturated red if you want to add a little bit of that alerting effects of night of light at night. This is just tunable example for healthcare. And then we also have schools where there are examples where we're also using these sort of lights coming from the ceiling with blue light that will increase the circadian stimulus without necessarily increasing the energy use. Now, you can make your own device. So we actually have a YouTube video where we call it Paper Sun. It's just a very easy way for you. And we did that in the time of COVID, where people were working at homes in very dark environments. So basically, we tell you how to build that, and that can deliver a saturated narrowband blue light, or just white light sources that vary from warm to cool. And the idea is you put one on each side of your computer screen to deliver that amount of light. And if you're going to work through the night, we recommend you do it with red, or you have a dim warm color at night. So finally, our final thoughts are that bright days and dim nights return to a more natural 24-hour light dark. We have shown in various field studies that the CS of 0.3 during the day and less than 0.1 at night is helping people improve sleep behavior and mood. And we suggest that for now you rely on the design guide, the UL design guide, and the general methodology. That will help you get where you want to get. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Hopefully it wasn't too quick, but we can answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very good, Mariana and Mark, for your nice presentation. There are indeed a few questions from the public. There is one question, actually coming 2 times, and is with respect to the slide number 11 of Mark's presentation. Mariana, if you could please go to the slide number 11.
Slide number 11, sure. Let me share. Okay.
Well, the question is why there are some negative values for the sensitive cool part compared to the warm part.
Go ahead, you can go.
No, I was just putting it on slideshow. I don't know why it didn't show up. Oh, sorry.
I wasn't able to, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
I wasn't able to go through the science of all of this, which is described in the document, but I'm very impressed that somebody picked that up because it is an important part. So let me give you an example. Let's assume, for example, that a person in the laboratory is looking at that they're looking at a box that's illuminated just with a blue LED, and you measure, say, their suppression. So if you look at the curve on the left, you can see that if I had a 460 nanometer blue LED, I'm right at the peak of the sensitivity. So it's going to be very effective. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that I suppress 50% melatonin at the light level I pick for that blue LED. Now, if I add low pressure sodium to that box, in other words, I'm going to put a little bit of low pressure sodium, it has an emission at about 589 nanometers. Now you'll notice that's in the negative region. So what happens is, if I now have the mixture, I've added more light, I've had my blue LED, I got 50% suppression. I'm going to add some low pressure sodium to it. I'm not taking anything away. I'm going to add the low pressure sodium. It turns out I'm only going to get 42% suppression now. So the way the retina works is it's looking like a balance scale. So when the blue LED, there's a lot of weight on one side of the balance, but if I put the yellow low pressure sodium, that balance comes closer to 0, and therefore you end up with less suppression. So if you want to predict polychromatic light, that is multiple spectra, spectral power distributions, you have to take into account both the positive and the negative balance act that goes on in the retina.
And the calculator does that.
Yeah, and the calculator for any spectral power distribution does that. Now, I want to point out, and this is, again, I don't mean to go in a lot of detail, but there are actually 2 curves there. The black one is V lambda, that's not part of it. But the red curve, turns out, if it's a yellowish light to start with, and you add, say, blue, but it's dominated by yellow, you will not get that subadditivity. So if you start on the yellow side and you add a little blue, you don't get an effect. But if you start on the blue side and add a little yellow, you can. So we have a mathematical characterization. But the important point I want to make is all of this is consistent with what we know about retinal neurophysiology. None of this is just curve fitting. This is all well understood among vision scientists about how that balance scale between blue and yellow work. But that's a great question. Sorry, I didn't have time to go into all the details.
Okay, thank you. No problem. Another question is whether it will be needed to consider the glare calculation within the circadian stimulus calculation.
The question is, if The question is if we're going to add a glare calculation into the circadian stimulus calculator.
Correct.
We could. We haven't done it, but we could, because we have been doing a lot of work with glare here, so we have the capability of doing that. We are actually in the process of updating the calculator with some of the revisions that we did to the CS model, and that's something that we can consider doing it.
Yeah, we also have a calculator for visual performance. So if you wanted to say, deliver 280 lux on the surface, you can take into account how old the person is, what the contrast and size is, and you can see if you're still on the plateau as well. So if you're taking some energy from the horizontal surface and you're putting it to the vertical surface, you can see what the consequences are for visual performance as well. So that calculator is also available.
Okay, thank you. Do you have some opinions of the people that has been exposed to lighting conditions under this UL recommendation? For example, Mariana, you have talked about studies for adolescents, for people with cancer, for elderly houses. Could you share a few of the opinions of these people?
In terms of the acceptance of the lighting, is that the question? The user acceptance?
Do people like it?
Yes.
Yeah, we actually have had an amazing acceptance. I work a lot with nursing homes and Alzheimer's patients and older people. And in fact, they flock to the light. They really, really like the light because in general, they're in very dim spaces and the light makes the spaces a lot brighter. So it's actually been very well accepted. We also work with office workers where we put those desktop lamps under the computer screens, and people did like it. Obviously, when we use the saturated color, they like it better because it's less bright, so it becomes less glarier than the white light. But in general, the response has been very good.
And when you install these kind of solutions, do you acknowledge the people that there will be a change in the lighting system, or they are completely not informed about the changes in the lighting?
Well, they do know that there are changes in the lighting. There's not much we can do, but what we do, especially in the studies with the Alzheimer's patients, we actually compare a light source that has the circadian effectiveness and a light source that does not. So we deliver sort of a dimmer, warmer color that does not have a high CS. And we don't tell them which one we're testing it. We just say we're just looking at what kind of color is better. So what kind of light color is better. So, you know, we try to use that as a placebo, but of course there's no, it's almost like a control light, but not necessarily a placebo because they know the lighting is being changed in the environment.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Let me check whether there are a few more questions from the public. If not, let me thank you again for the presentation. And we would like to continue on to the few education questions or educations that are mainly related to the relation of your work with education research institutes. The first question is whether which aspects of the influence of light in the physiological response of human beings are still with an incipient understanding and therefore constitute a research question for tomorrow.
You want to answer?
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Understand.
So you're asking about the lighting characteristics, right? That we think needs more research. Is that correct?
Distribution.
Well, I have to say there's a couple. I think we know very well about amount and spectrum, and I would not recommend that to be a research question. I think the distribution is very important. We are doing some work here looking at what parts of the retina are more effective at receiving the light. So I think distribution is very important. I also think duration is something like a trade-off. So can you, for example, reduce the CS of 0.3 to a CS of 0.2 if you increase the duration of exposure, for example? So I think that trade-off between amount and amount duration is something that I don't think we know very well. We can probably do some calculations and estimate, but I don't think there's enough data out there in the field for that. And I think that there's also one important thing is individual differences. And that may or may not be related to what we call photic history, which is how much light do you get during the day will impact your sensitivity to light at night. And that's another area that I think could be better investigated in field studies.
Okay. During your presentation, you comment that there are some cultural differences in the architecture. For example, in Brazil, houses are having more windows, while in the States it's not always the case. Besides that, do you consider that the circadian response of human beings might have cultural factors that could give us, as Latin American region, an opportunity to research something specific of our culture?
I think so. For example, we do a lot of work with Sweden, and the Swedish love warm color lights. And right now we actually have a project where we are delivering good circadian stimulus with fixtures that are delivering a 3000K light. So it's a warm color light and you can still deliver the circadian stimulus. So on the other hand, in Asia, people are very comfortable with the 6500K. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunities to look at the mood and the ambient and the aesthetics and what each culture like, and then tune to that culture. The other thing that I think is not very well known, and Mark alluded to that a little bit, is, you know, about the tunable. We know that physiologically you don't need the tunable to have an impact on the circadian system. But the question is, do people like better because there's a change, because it's a dynamic light source? Do people have a preference for that? And how does that affect mood and sleepiness and fatigue, for example? I don't think we have enough research that has been done in these kinds of areas. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the cultural issues. I think the biology is the same for humans around the globe, but there may be cultural requirements that may counteract that biology. Like, do you take a siesta in the midday? Do you get up with dawn, or do you tend to sleep in on weekends, for example? Those specific recommendations for people that say want to stay up late or go to bed early, I think have to be adjusted based upon to reflect the cultural values that need to be adjusted. So there are going to be, and I think first and foremost, we are a social species, notwithstanding COVID-19, which has sort of limited us all to social interaction. But if you come back to that, there are people don't always do the right thing for themselves, whether it's diet and exercise or light, and a lot of those are driven by cultural expectations. So what would be really cool is that reflecting those cultural expectations, if a specific light-dark pattern was given to help for that particular culture, that may not work in Sweden, but it may work very well in Colombia. So I think thinking about the social context of applying circadian light is really critical, and that has to come from you folks. It can't come from us, because we aren't in that culture and don't necessarily know what those cultural norms are. So I keep saying the same thing, but I want to say one more time, is that the biology is the same, but the cultural expectations may change the way it's delivered. And I think that's really sophisticated and interesting.
Yes. So indeed, we have opportunities as region to explore what are the cultural biases of the circadian response.
Yes.
Correct.
Thank you. There are a lot of that. Let's move now onto the education questions. So the majority of master and specialization programs in lighting comprise mainly physics, industrial design, and engineering courses. With the transition of lighting to a human-centered design approach, how will you enhance or formulate a good curriculum in lighting?
Well, I think there are fundamentals that we all need to be aware of. What I'm disappointed in is some of the educational programs haven't changed in 20 years, and yet the technology and the science have advanced quite considerably in the last 20 years. Arguably in lighting, there's been more changes in the last 20 years than, you know, maybe the previous 80 years. So I think that educational programs have to keep up with the changes, the rapid changes. So for example, we've developed mathematical models to predict how long an LED will last as it's actually operated. Whether it's in the home or it's in an office, that will change the way you can expect the LED life to go. I don't think there was, and since we are doing the research to do it, it's my understanding that there is no educational program other than ours right now that teaches people how to predict the life of an LED in an actual application. So I think we have to keep up with that, and there needs to be a broader understanding. Now, this was about human-centric lighting, and I think that we are able to also bring the science more quickly to that. But I think what would be great is if there was a more formal network that we could get the research to the students more quickly than probably happens right now. So I think we're at a time when things are happening fast, but I'm not sure the educational programs have kept up with the speed of development in the last 20 years. So I would argue that speed is maybe the most important part of the educational change that I'd like to see happen globally.
Yes. So it's very important to have a high dynamics to the education and to move very fast the results of our research projects onto the courses that we are developing with the students.
Exactly. That's a lot of work for the teacher, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, sure. Well, the COVID is worldwide, and many education institutions have been forced to move their activities to the virtual world. You and your team as professors at the Rensselaer Institute of Technology, which didactic tools have you been using or plan to use in the coming weeks and months with the pandemic?
Well, one of the ones that we are pioneering now is how to measure ultraviolet. As you're seeing with COVID, there's a lot of interest in using UV as a disinfectant. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about how to do it, what's safe. And I think that we are exploring, and I think successfully exploring, ways not just to do a PowerPoint presentation, but we have multiple cameras set up in the laboratories so that we can see in a dynamic way how people can make those measurements safely and accurately. And I think that's been a challenge for us, but I think we've responded quite well on UV. It's a new topic. You normally don't get that. And being able to convey that virtually, I think is been a challenge, but I think to some extent, well, to a large extent, we've been very successful. I think we're trying to bring that same philosophy to the other courses, the more traditional courses that we have. The other thing I'd like to say, coming back to my earlier point, that we're a social species. We've created what we call lighting chat, which is a time for the students to interact with the professors in a more informal way. So we require them to have a glass of wine in their hand while they're having the conversation. And I think that's also a very successful compensation for the lack of face-to-face, this time out where you can actually spend time between the students and the professors, students to students, and have a conversation about anything related to lighting. I think that's been really good too. So I recommend that as well as trying to do things like have multiple cameras set up in the laboratory. Those are more difficult, but it's easy enough to make those social bonds continue. Obviously not as good as face-to-face, but I think it's important from an educational point of view.
So actually the COVID circumstances have enabled or improved this mentoring function for you as professor. And as for the more practical or experimental courses, extra technological resources such as cameras during the practices are key in the developing of these practical concepts.
Was that a question? I'm sorry.
Summarized.
Yes, I thought you were summarizing, but I thought it was there a question for me? I wasn't sure. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
And the last question is, as consequence of this virtual education, not everything can be negative, also some positive things. Geographic location is less than a barrier to enroll to education programs. Do your university have possibilities for international students to enroll to programs or courses virtually?
I would say we have what's called outreach education, but that's not a formal credit with the university. It's an informational program. But I think I predict in a year or so you'll see many universities beginning to offer degree programs virtually. We're certainly looking into that, but we don't have anything for a degree program right now virtually. But we do have a number of these educational offerings, like how to measure UV, that people internationally take. So I think that is a sort of a transition to maybe a degree program course in lighting, but we don't have one now.
Okay, we look forward to having them.
Yes.
Okay, with that, let us close your intervention. Mark and Mariana, it has been a very nice and contributing presentation to the topic of human-centric lighting. We really hope the moment to welcoming you in Colombia as the pandemic is over. Thank you very much, and you are welcome to continue in the conference as you want.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I join the public in a virtual applause.
Thank you.
Okay, to the audience, we will continue in 15 minutes with our next conference, which is, perdón, en 15 minutos continuaremos con la próxima conferencia, que son las nuevas tecnologías disruptivas en iluminación, estado y desafíos, por parte de Michael Paplowski. Démonos un descanso, estiremos las piernas, tomemos agua y nos vemos faltando un cuarto para las 12.
Gracias, Juan Pablo.